All right. We have not met to talk about Matthew in 6 weeks. I think I had 5 weeks. Well, I had 4 weeks off, and then because of vacation and work and other things. And then last week we just had a really good week of fellowship and conversation. So I enjoyed that. I hope you did as well. This week we're going to dive right back in at the very end of Matthew chapter 7. It is actually not part of what we know of as the Sermon on the Mount. It is just kind of the addendum to the Sermon on the Mount. If we look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, if you'll remember, Jesus has gone through 3 chapters worth, and we've gone through 3 months worth or more of talking about this sermon and the points that Jesus made in this sermon. And then Matthew says in verse 28, when Jesus had finished saying these things, and when Paul finally got off of them, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Why were they amazed? Well, let me tell you, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Authority. What do we understand that to mean? When Jesus taught with authority, what have you always understood that to mean? He knows what he's talking about. Now, does that mean that the teachers of the law didn't know what they were talking about? That is the point right there. When the rabbis or when the teachers of the law would dialogue about the laws, and they would contribute to this large catalog of commentary on the law, and they would teach their disciples about the law, most of the time it was, I'm going to call it regurgitation. They deferred to or referred to another rabbi in the past, or someone higher or better known. You know, sometimes when we want to act like we know what we're talking about, we name drop. Don't we? And we name drop someone a little more important or a little more impressive than we are. And this is what the rabbis did. That's just one of the ways that they taught. Rabbi so-and-so, maybe 120 years ago, explains it this way. When I was in research, we always called it the case method. Copy and steal everything. Because that's kind of what, you do in research. You get a whole bunch of what other people have said. You sift through it, you culminate it, and then you spit it back out with hopefully some thought and some, understanding. Well, this is what they did. They copied and stole it from what people before them had said. This is how rabbis taught. Jesus didn't teach like that. Jesus spoke on his own authority. He didn't defer to someone in the past. If he deferred to anybody, it was God in heaven. And so he taught with an authority that was so significantly different than what they were used to, than what the rabbis would do. And so they're like, wow, this guy's different. He's teaching as if he knows all of this stuff. He's teaching as if he doesn't even have to postulate it. He's teaching as if he is the author of this information. So he taught with such authority that the crowds were amazed. Because that's not something that commonly they heard. You could go back to prophets when the prophets would say, the Lord has spoken to me and this is what he says. That's the closest that they may have come to of having the kind of authority that Jesus spoke with. Okay. So that's what I think is being intended here when it says they were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. Okay, now I want to jump back to before the Sermon on the Mount for just a snippet. We're going to go back, and I have it up here, Matthew chapter 4, right before, and we talked about this when we were talking about Matthew 4, right before Matthew gets into the Sermon on the Mount, he says that Jesus went throughout all of Galilee, Verse 23, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. Okay, we've gone through chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. We would call that the teaching. So he was teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the news of the kingdom. That's 5, 6, and 7. Matthew now is going to move into a dialogue or a narrative about the healing. So Matthew sets the stage all the way back in chapter 4 that says, okay, again in research, when you write a paper, you generally tell people what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then at the end you say what you said, you tell them what you said. So this is what he says that he's going to do. Jesus went through Galilee, he was teaching, and he was healing. News about him spread all over Syria. The people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. And large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Flip with me to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. We're going to call this the end point, the bookend. Matthew 4 was the beginning, where Matthew says, here's what I'm going to tell you. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 was the teaching. Matthew 8 and 9 is the healing. And now he's going to close it out in Matthew 9, verse 35. Once again, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. Beginning, meat, end. Kind of like a sandwich. And so now we get to talk for two chapters about some of the healing activity that Jesus did. And I think, I don't know that I can stand very strongly on this, but it is possible that this kind of closes out the first segment of what Matthew really wanted to push out. He talked about who Jesus was, Matthew chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then he says, here's what Jesus said and did. And that kind of closes out, in essence, the good news. Now, Matthew does go on and tells us more, and it may be that he compiled this. Remember, Matthew is not teaching linearly. He's not writing things in a linear fashion. He's writing to the Jews for a specific purpose. What was his purpose? Remember, we talked about this a long time ago. It is a long time ago now. Matthew wanted to emphasize Jesus as King, Jesus as Messiah. So he's not so interested in telling the linear story as he is telling episodes that give evidence to Jesus as the Messiah, that give evidence to Jesus as the King. And so I think this potentially could be, all the way through chapter 9, his first effort in that. And then, as Matthew lived on and time played out, he said, okay, let's just add to what I've written. And so we see more, and there's a lot more stuff that happens, but I really like how he kind of puts the bookends on the teaching and the activities of Jesus in Matthew 4 and Matthew 9. Going back to Matthew 8. When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Now, in Matthew 4 and Matthew 9, he talks about Jesus having gone throughout all of Galilee. Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, he was also a Roman general in the wars, and he lived, just almost at the same time as Jesus. There was a little bit of overlap there, but one might say contemporary. So that's the time Josephus lived. Josephus tells us there were 204 towns in Galilee, villages and towns. It is possible to perceive that Jesus might have visited all of them. Okay? That's possible. We do know that Jesus' ministry itself centered around Galilee. He rarely went outside of the area of Galilee. You remember the little map? There it is. Galilee kind of looks like the harp That's the reason it has the name. And Capernaum is right here. Capernaum is kind of his headquarters. And Galilee kind of went up this way and a bit down this way, and it kind of goes over here. Over here was Gentile land, Decapolis. Most of the 10 cities, the big 10 cities of the Decapolis, were over here. Jesus' ministry took place primarily around the Sea of Galilee, mostly in Galilee itself, but also he did some things over here. We'll read about them in chapter 8. He did go down, remember the Jordan River, he went down to Jerusalem when? When would Jesus have gone to Jerusalem? I'm sorry? When he's 12. And he went down when he was 12 because of the festivals, the holidays. So Jesus, being a good Jew, would go to Jerusalem for the required festivals. But he didn't necessarily go to Jerusalem for ministry. His ministry, his ministerial activities, more or less stayed up here around Galilee. Now, there were a couple of other times that he went up here with his disciples, and he went way over here by himself, Tyre and Sidon, and then he also went to Caesarea Philippi. But most of the other activity was in Galilee. So, Matthew tells us he went throughout Galilee and did his work. When Jesus comes down from the mountain, we should not think that this is linear. Oh, Jesus just finished teaching this big sermon, and then right now, when he comes down from the mountain, all of a sudden he meets a leper. Remember, Matthew is not teaching linearly. He's not stringing things together in linear fashion, but he's pulling things together to tell a story. And so to do that, he says, okay, Jesus has taught. This is the essence of Jesus' teaching. Now, to get into the essence of Jesus' activity in healing, the first thing we're going to look at is this leper. Jesus can heal leprosy. So, let's read that. Verse 2, Matthew 8, verse 2. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone. We'll talk about that in a minute. But go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Let's go through this a little bit by little bit. Compared to Luke 5, this is the comparison story in the Synoptic Gospels. Luke 5 does not have the leper coming to him in the midst of the crowds. Remember, there were crowds listening to him on the mountainside. But Luke 5 just says that at one time a leper came to him. Let me get to that. Luke chapter 5, verse 12. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And the story continues just as Matthew describes it. So a lot of people try to make some issue about the fact that this leper, who was not supposed to be near other people, was in the midst of this crowd. Yeah, I don't think that's really the way it played out. That's how Matthew kind of makes it sound, but I don't think the Jews understood it that way, and I don't think we should understand it that way. Let's talk about what it means to be a leper. The leprosy that we know of today is usually called Hansen's disease. And that Hansen's disease is actually a pretty bad kind of, it's almost absolutely curable today. Modern medicine, modern technology, as long as it's caught early enough, it can be taken care of today. If it's not taken care of, it affects the nervous system, it affects the extremities, it affects the skin, the nostrils, the mouth. And what it does is it kind of shuts your body down over time. And it's evidenced by ugly skin, both kind of a white skin, white flake swim skin, and now we're getting into stuff that I'm kind of sort of understanding. and then open sores. And what it will do over time, you'll lose sensation because it's a nerve thing. And I've got a whole bunch of this stuff here written down. Let's see. This is from the CDC. Hansen's disease, also known as leprosy, is an infection caused by the bacteria, here we go, Mycobacterium leprae, thus leprous. These bacteria can grow very slowly, and it may take up to 20 years to develop signs of the infection. It can affect nerves, skin, eyes, lining of the nose. The bacteria attack the nerves. It causes the loss of the ability to sense touch or to sense pain. So these people might put their hand on what we nowadays would have a stove and not know that they were burning their hand. And this says, it's kind of gross, but your body could potentially reabsorb your appendages. I don't know how that happens. So it gives the it gives the impression that you've lost fingers or lost hands. I don't know how your body reabsorbs those, but that's what they're saying here. There are cases in the Bible that describe leprosy, but they don't fully describe it to that extent. When Moses was confronted by God and commissioned by God, Moses had his own doubts. Remember? And God says, put forth your hand, or put your hand in your cloak. And he drew it out, and his hand was leprous. Ah! And then God says, put it in, and he pulled it out, and it was healed. And he said, let that be a sign. If that's not enough to convince them, the fact that it is leprous, if that's not enough to convince them, how about the healing of the leprosy? And so when you go talk to the Israelites, let that be a sign to them. Miriam, you remember when Miriam got a little put out with Moses being so special? And so she thought big of herself, and she went to Aaron, and they kind of went to Moses in a huff and said, you're not the only one God talks to. And God says, come here. And what did he do to Miriam? She broke out in what's described as leprosy. Okay? And then Aaron's like, oh, I'm sorry. And, please don't let this happen. And so Moses prayed to God. Miriam was healed, but she still had to go through the 7 days of cleansing process. So that was in Numbers. 2 Kings 5 talks about two people who had leprosy. The first one was Naaman. You remember Naaman? Naaman was not an Israelite, but he was looking for someone who could heal him. And he heard about this fella in Israel that could do this. Well, when a non-countryman hears about someone else in another country that could help them, it was not customary to go to that person initially. You go to the king. And it's almost like asking permission. And so Naaman went to the king. And the king said, not me. What, you're coming to challenge me, and I don't like this. But Elijah, am I saying that right? I believe it's Elijah, said, he found out about this, and he told the king, hey, send him to me. And so Naaman went to Elijah, and Elijah told him to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. You know that story. And after some frustration, he did, and he was healed. Now, the other person who had, in that same chapter, who had leprosy was Elijah's servant. Why? Because Elijah's servant took it on himself to go, one, lie to Naaman. Elijah said, no, I don't want your gifts. I did not heal your leprosy. God did. I don't need your gifts. I don't want your gifts. And so Naaman started back home. He said, please let me take some dirt, because when I offer sacrifices, I don't want to offer sacrifices to some other god. I now recognize your God is the God, and I want some of Israel's dirt to offer those sacrifices on. That's what he was taking home. But he had come with this entourage in payment. And Gehazi hears that Elijah didn't want payment, and so he pushed Naaman off, and Gehazi's like, that's not right. We ought to have something out of that. And so he goes and he lies to Naaman, and Naaman, of course, gives him what Gehazi asked for. And Elijah says, oh, where you been, Gehazi? lied to Elijah and said, you know what? Because of your behavior, you're going to now inherit the leprosy that Naaman had. And Gehazi then was leprous. So that's another instance that we have of leprosy in the Old Testament. One more in the Old Testament was King Uzziah. King Uzziah was actually a good king. He more or less led with the Lord. You know, you hear all those kings that, you know, he opposed the Lord and he did not do what the Lord wanted to do. Well, Uzziah actually did. But there was a point in Uzziah's life that he got a little too big for his own britches. And so he decided he would go offer incense to the Lord in the temple. Well, that wasn't the king's place, was it? The priests were supposed to do that. Well, when the priest confronted him, Uzziah got mad and started ranting and raving to the priests. And guess what? God said, all right, leprous. And so he lived out the rest of his days as a leper in solitude. Okay, that's another instance that we read about of leprosy existing in the Old Testament. Now, Jesus in Luke 4 actually says that there were many who were leprous in the time of Elijah. We just don't necessarily read about them. Yeah.
In that time, short of God curing them, there wasn't a cure for leprosy, was there? And it's curable now with modern medicine.
Right, right. If you got what we now refer... Oh, say again?
They were outcast.
They were outcast. If you got what we refer to as leprosy, and we're going to get to that because the law is not necessarily exclusive to leprosy. It includes a lot of things. But leprosy is one of those things that the law designates. But if you got what we know as leprosy, you were outside the camp and it was basically to the death. You just... You did. They had Jesus healed the 10 lepers. The 10 lepers were outside of the town. They couldn't now at one point at least the synagogues had small rooms where lepers could come in. They were kind of closed off, isolated. It was the exposure. It was, God's laws were not laws to be mean. He never cast a law just to exclude people or to be mean or to even see how dedicated they were to the fellowship. God's laws, especially concerning the infectious skin diseases, was to make sure the populace, the community, was healthy. And so to do that, you isolate individuals who are not healthy. And so that's what would happen. They had places where these unhealthy people would go outside the camp. And in a lot of cases, as in the leper, they weren't allowed to interact or touch clean people. And we'll read about that. If you want to, go ahead and turn to Leviticus 13. We'll talk just briefly about the law of infectious skin diseases. But that's kind of what happened. So yes, it was in that particular disease was a disease to the death, unless God provided the cure. That's important. Because remember, I said Naaman went to the king. And here's what the king says. Let me turn to it right quick if I can find it. That's 2 Chronicles. No, I think... I've got it on another page. No, I don't. I didn't write it down. So let's go to 2 Chronicles. This is how big of a deal healing leprosy was. 2 Chronicles 26. When Naaman came to the king... No, that's the wrong... 2 Kings 5. Hello, Paul. 2 Kings 5, yeah. When Naaman came to the king, verse 7, the king says, he tore his robes, and he says, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life?" Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? How do I read that? Curing leprosy is as difficult or as admirable as bringing someone back to life. Who does that? Am I God? The king recognized he can't do it. Mortal man can't do it. God is the one who brings people back to life, and that is akin to making the leper whole. So this is how big of a deal healing leprosy was, that particular type of leprosy was, to the populace. Take that back to the leper who approached Jesus. If you are willing, who can make me clean? You can make me clean. What was he saying? You've got the power of God. Yes. That's faith. And Jesus says, I will. I will. Quickly, Leviticus 13. This is the law. And it's actually the law not of the leper. This is the law of infectious skin diseases. So there were lots of various skin diseases that you may have. Some of them are not permanent, and it describes that. Some of them are. But real quickly, verse 1, chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash or a shiny spot on their skin that may be a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on the skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling skin disease. When the priest examines that person, he shall pronounce them ceremonially unclean. If the shiny spot on the skin is white but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair on it has not turned white, the priest is to isolate that affected person for 7 days. Now, isolate does not mean set outside the camp in this case. It means kind of like quarantine. To make sure that they're still part of the community, but they just can't go interact. Okay? Where was I? On the 7th day, verse 5, the priest is to examine them, and if he sees the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he's to isolate them for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine them again. If the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a rash. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the rash does spread in the skin, after they have shown themselves to the priest to be pronounced clean, they must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine that person. If the rash has spread in the skin, he shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. He goes on, when anyone has a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine them. If there's is a white swelling in the skin and it has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce them unclean. He is not to isolate them, so you don't quarantine this person. They're already unclean. Skip that step. Move on to the next step. Go all the way down to, the end. Not necessarily the end. Verse 45. Well, it is. It's close to the end. Verse 45. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. Let their hair be unkempt. Cover the lower part of their face and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. Again, this is a protection for the community. It is not a punishment for the person. Okay? Got to keep that in mind. But because this person is unclean, because there is a skin infection of some kind, and it's a growing one, it's not a healing one, It's a skin infection that seems to be persistent, it's chronic, it's growing. They must live the rest of their lives outside the camp. And their family can't even touch them. Their family could come see them, bring them food, wave at them from afar. So if you think about it, the life of a leper is a very lonely life. And this is why a lot of them lived in communities. One, they're out there, anyway. They're all cast out of the community. But if you were already a leper, it was kind of okay to touch another leper. You were unclean anyway. So that they grouped together a lot of times. But it was a very lonely existence. And that's another reason why Jesus, I believe, felt it important to touch the leper. Now, there's a lot of people that make a big deal about Jesus was disobeying the law because, you're not supposed to touch a leper and whatnot. But you have to understand two things. One, Jesus is above the law. But two, as soon as Jesus touched him, he was no longer a leper. Cleansed. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Done. But that touch was so important to the leper. We will read in the next one, Jesus doesn't even go in the house. There is no touch. But that's not what was important in that scenario. That's what was important in this one. This man was touched by Jesus. This man may have not felt a human touch in a very long time. But he was touched by Jesus. So we've talked about the condition. We've talked about the consequences. Let's talk about the healing. Okay? They believed, and in this particular case, it was true, God provided the healing. This was not something, it was not a rash, we read about that, it was not a rash that heals itself. This was a chronic issue that stayed with you till you died. If you were healed of it, you were healed of it by God. Okay? We talked about that. If you go, well, let's read one more time. Keep your finger there in Leviticus. But let's go back to Matthew and reread this one little section. Verse 4. Well, right before it. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said, verse 4, see that you don't tell anyone. Oh, let's stop for a second right there. Why? Why not tell people? Let's talk. It wasn't his time. Mark gives us a little more of a description. If we look over at Mark chapter 1, it's the same episode. Once again, it's in the Synoptic Gospels, so they all three tell the same story. They tell it a little differently. But Mark tells us in chapter 1, verse 43, he gives us the story. And then he says, Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest, offer the sacrifices, etc. Verse 45, instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. Well, wouldn't you? I mean, really, wouldn't you? But here's what Mark says. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in loneliness. No, because of the crowds. Because the news spread so fast, so far, that anytime Jesus walked into town, he was an instant celebrity. And not only that, everyone wanted to bring their sick people to him. And so it made, from a practical standpoint, it made Jesus' ministry a little bit more difficult. And so Jesus had to spend much of his ministry outside of the towns. One, to accommodate the number of people that came to him. But two, just because of the pressing in. The fact that so many people wanted to him. We'll talk about in another episode here in the same chapter. Remember the woman who the crowds were pressing in, but she said, if I could just touch the hem of his robe. This is the kind of experience Jesus had. And so I think, from a practical standpoint, that's really why Jesus is saying, don't tell anybody. It's not that he didn't want to be known. It's not that he didn't want people to talk about God and glorify God. It's just a practical standpoint. Hey, go do what you need to do, but don't spread the news everywhere. We're still early in this ministry, and I've got a long ways to go. Also, one could argue that that would stir up the Pharisees and the priests and the teachers of the law, and they might try to approach him earlier than his time. And so he was delaying that time when the sacrifice with the crucifixion would take place. One could also say that. Really kind of out of time, but let's do Leviticus 14. How do you get back into this thing? God cures you. Jesus tells this leper to go offer the sacrifices. What were the sacrifices? Those are described in Leviticus 14. But it's a weird one. It's a really kind of strange thing they have to do. These are the regulations for a diseased person, not a deceased person, diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing when they're brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp, examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest should order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. Then the priest shall order that one of the birds be killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He is then to take the live bird and dip it, together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, into the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the defiling disease, and then pronounce them clean. After that, he is to release the live bird in the open fields. What on earth? Okay? I'm going to say I cannot be absolutely confident, but I'm going to suggest something. And this is not found in a lot of commentaries, but there are some people out there that say this is a possibility. Let me get to my notes so I don't screw this up. 2 birds, 1 bird dies, the other is dipped, or might we say baptized, in the blood of the first. Eventually, that bird is released, free from consequences. Cedar wood might represent the cross, sacrifice that Jesus had to make. Scarlet yarn. If you read John, he talks about the scarlet robe that was placed on Jesus at the time of his sacrifice. Hyssop. Hyssop was a plant that was used in a lot of ceremonies, a lot of sacrifices. Hyssop was first used for, we read hyssop with its first association to sacrifices in the story of the Passover. They were to paint the blood on the doorframe using hyssop. Go all the way to the crucifixion. The hyssop branch was the stalk or the staff that they raised to give Jesus bitter wine or vinegar to drink. So, 2 birds, 1 dies, the other is baptized in blood, released, along with the cedar wood, the scarlet thread, and the hyssop. Might the cleansing of a leper, which can only be done by God, somehow reflect, and the practice of the ritual of cleansing reflect the cleansing of sin through the sacrifice and the baptism that we experience.
That's like a precursor.
I'm sorry?
That's kind of like a precursor of what's to come.
It is. If we read it that way, it's a precursor of what's to come. Absolutely. And we could see, and I don't know if Tyson's still doing his Leviticus class, there are a lot of the rituals in Leviticus that do cast forward this idea of what Jesus, the coming of Jesus, what he had to go through. And it kind of, God knew way ahead of time what was going to happen. And Leviticus speaks to that. So, is this that? Again, I can't adamantly say absolutely. But wow, what an interesting coincidence. Yeah. So the leper goes to the priest, presents himself, goes through this sacrifice of cleansing. This ceremony of cleansing. There are other activities that they have to do in the way of sacrifices. And there is question about when Jesus says, let this be, where does he say it? A testimony to them. What does that mean? We don't know. Is it a testimony to the priests that God is now on earth? God cleansed a leper. Hello? Wake up. Possibly. But we really don't know what is testimony to them in the Old Testament, those people in the Old Testament, the testimony that was given to them. We're not sure. So I can't claim one thing or another. But that's the story of the leper. That's the first of, get this, 10 healings that Matthew describes. Now, what's interesting about these 10 healings? It comes right after Jesus' reiteration of the law. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reiterates the real essence of the law, and then it's followed up with 10 healings. Now, don't think the Jews didn't think about Moses and the giving of the law and the 10 commandments that summarize the law. All of a sudden we see Jesus talking about the kingdom, and we talking about how the law leads to the kingdom. And here are 10 evidences of that kingdom being established. There's a link there. We don't see it as much in our culture because we don't live and breathe it. But they lived and breathed it, and they probably went, oh, now isn't that curious? Just something to leave you with. Next week, wow, we didn't get very far again. But next week we're going to do the faith of the centurion and possibly more. So let's pray and have an awesome, blessed week. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for your word. And that we can open it and read it freely. Father, we thank you that we're able to think about it, to chew on its words, to think through what it might mean, both to the people to whom it was written, but also to us as we read it today. Help us, Father, as we read it and understand it, magnify you and glorify you. And Father, as we do that, help other people see us, that we may have so much joy in our lives that they wonder about what is going on with us, and that they want a part of it. Help us to be your voice. Help us to be your hands. Help us to be your feet. As we go out these doors, as we participate in the life around us, help us to always glorify you. Father, thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you for his willingness to come to earth, his willingness to be the sacrifice that takes our sin away. We love him and we praise him. It's through him we pray. Amen.